Chris, thank you very much, and thank you for organising this event, which is just so lovely to be here talking to you all and listening to you all talk. Especially the last two papers were just absolutely wonderful talks that I'm rather thinking I wish I'd given my talk yesterday after that. But anyway, here we are. Before beginning, if I could just say a very brief word about the series that Joanna and I run with Bloomsbury. It's great that Rick and Massimiliana and Vera are all here today, who are the authors of the three books that are currently out in the series. And those of you that were in Oxford last week will remember I said a few words about it there. If you or anyone you know has interests in contributing to the series with any ideas, then please just get in touch and have a chat with Joanna or myself. We're really open to any good suggestions. So the more good work on SARE that we can get out, the better, and that's what we want. Okay, my talk today will sketch out how Michel Serres' idea of a natural contract is connected to narrative, and specifically how a contract can take a narrative form and what this might mean. It's really to indicate how this happens and to raise the question. To do this, I'll briefly outline Serres' proposal for a natural contract and then return to his account of Lucretius and the birth of physics to see how narrative becomes important there. Then I'll touch on Serres' suggestion that the natural contract should comply with Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, before trying briefly to pull together some of the key points that I think have emerged along the way. So those of you that did hear me talk last week in Oxford will recognise that the beginning is quite similar, but don't worry, at a certain point it diverges and we end up with a different paper, right? In the natural contract, Michel Serres proposes that the social contract needs to be rewritten to include nature. On the face of it, the argument is a simple one. As the founding, oops, whole text has just disappeared. 1 second, I'm sure it's there somewhere. There we go. On the face of it, the argument is a simple one. As the founding act in modern societies, the social contract explicitly excludes nature, which has then encouraged our violence towards nature and left it without protection. Now that we can no longer ignore the consequences of the destruction we've caused, we're having to find ways to protect the non-human world while also coming to terms with the non-human world, not just as an object, but as a quasi-subject that is reacting to what we have done. Serres' approach in the natural contract and in other texts is to argue for an extension of democratic rights and representation to the non-human world, for example, in the form of a transnational organisation to advocate on behalf of water, air, fire, earth, and life. There are good reasons for Serres to choose law as a means to reform the relation between the human and non-human worlds. Varieties of law in both science and politics feature in both science and politics, and there's a long history of thinking and practice that deals with the relations between the human and the non-human worlds as mediated by ideas of law. More pragmatically, the language of democratic rights and representation is familiar to us, and there are already institutions to support it. We know how it works. It can be modified. However important this might be, does the idea of extending rights and representation to the non-human world solve the problems? Does it go far enough? There are reasons to doubt this. It's not easy to determine the rights of natural phenomena, and it may be difficult to determine what constitutes harm or an infringement on a basic freedom. Arguably, such difficulties arise because the political philosophy underlying the social contract begins with the conception of a free individual. And while this may in fact always have been a problematic idea, it's harder still to determine the basic freedoms of a river, a forest, a colony of ants, or whatever. The interdependency and profoundly relational character of the natural world doesn't sit easily within the framework of a liberal politics, where individuals come first and their relations are managed then by institutions. These difficulties are well known, and I won't go into them here. The fact that Serres' philosophy does not sit comfortably within the political language he adopted there to argue for a natural contract may suggest that he was just being pragmatic. But it also suggests that there is more to his appeal to the idea of a contract than the inclusion of the non-human world in human institutions as we know them. Serres addresses the idea of a contract through his reading of Lucretius in the Birth of Physics, so we can reasonably turn to this text for help in thinking about the natural contract as Serres presents it in the book of that name. Okay, so Lucretius imagines a state in which across the universe atoms rained down in parallel lines, a state of perfect equilibrium in which there can be no change, no combinations, and nothing can exist. But spontaneously and without being caused by anything, here and there an atom swerves from its path, setting off a chain reaction of collisions and creating turbulence. As atoms collide, combine, the turbulence turns into vortices, dynamic quasi-stable forms of order that emerge contingently, survive for a time, and eventually break down to release their atoms back into the flow. Everything can be described as a vortex, from things to forms of life to worlds. As a model, it describes a system that is characterized by flow, not solid bodies, open, that is open, atoms can enter the quasi-stable vortical pattern and leave it, that it is dynamic, it's quasi-stable but not static. What remains quasi-stable is the form of change, and that is non-linear. Turbulent flows are unpredictable and do not follow the laws of classical mechanics. Okay, as atoms combine in this model, they exhibit forms of regularity, and in such cases, Lucretius generally uses the term foedus to refer to the constraints on how atoms can move and combine, and therefore what things can exist as a result. Foedus is often translated as law, but the modern conception of law is misleading. Modern science assumes that laws are timeless and precede causality. Serres reverses this reasoning to say that causality precedes law. Events happen, contracts are struck, and only where they remain especially stable can we speak of laws, and even then not as timeless. Okay, from this brief detour through the Birth of Physics, we can already see at least, I'm sure there's more ways we can think of, but at least 3 ways that the sense of contract proposed by Serres is shaped by narrative. First, as I've already outlined, events follow one another without being initially determined by law. The order that emerges from turbulence takes the form of regularities in the flow of atoms through which then things hang together. What a thing is and how it came to be is therefore determined not by a law, by an initial law of any kind, but by the events that led to and constitute certain regularities, that is, by history or histories. Although regularities may become settled and law-like, the fact that deviations and bifurcations continue to occur means that histories remain important and that the world can be seen as a complex, dynamic, and layered set of pathways, something that Serres, in a different context, calls the grand narrative. If we understand a contract to be a regularity that is immanent to events, then we can say that a contract is itself narrative in form before it is law-like. It has come to exist through a series of events, continues to exist as long as events follow a similar pattern, and may change without being completely undone. Of course, it may also change more dramatically or cease to exist entirely. That's the first sense of narrative. Okay, 3 senses. Second, there are specific narratives that we write that have to do with the human relation to the non-human. Here we can think above all of eco-criticism, where stories about the human relation to the non-human reveal the complex history of such relations. And Stephanie Postumus, who was going to be here joining this event over these couple of days, obviously has written a great deal on this, specifically in relation to Serres. Third, there is what Serres describes as the relation between the local and the global. As he often writes, to think is to invent, and to invent is to communicate beyond one's own safe patch of ground. It's to go out and to establish a relation to a new neighbor. As communication, it's not just to follow an existing narrative, but to contribute to a new narrative. And in doing so, to move towards the global by linking one locality to another. Serres elaborates this idea in multiple ways. It's there in the idea of translation that informs his thinking from very early days. It shapes his understanding of the relation between different disciplines, such as the sciences and the humanities. And it's there too in the way that he describes the operation of the sciences themselves today, particularly those sciences which combine or communicate in climate science. Now, all of these three senses are important, but I'd like to focus in the remaining time on the third sense here, that the sense of narrative formed by linking one locality to another. Okay, let's go back then to the natural contract. In the chapter Science Law, Serres there invokes Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason to describe the natural contract in terms of equilibrium. The principle, he writes, states both that each thing has its own sufficient reason, a reason why it is as it is and not otherwise, and that why it is as it is and not otherwise, and that reasons must be given back or rendered to all things. Short quotation here from that section of the text. He writes, the world globally and phenomena, proximate, local or remote, are given to us. It would be an injustice, a disequilibrium, for us to receive this given free, without ever rendering anything in return. Equity therefore demands that we render at least as much as we receive. In other words, that we do so sufficiently. Now, in this passage, in this context, disequilibrium denotes that we take without giving, like a parasite rather than a symbiont. But what are we to give back in order to be just, to establish equilibrium? To observe the principle of sufficient reason is to recognize that there is a reason for everything to be as it is and not otherwise. But this recognition in this context here cannot be just abstract. Just talking about it, just me explaining this as an idea here, in itself makes no difference. Rather, it must be enacted, actually by discerning the differences between things as best we can. The principle of sufficient reason calls on us actually to attend to things, to their relations, and actually to respond, to communicate, to link one locality with another. And in doing so, to play our part in establishing an equilibrium. Okay, so let's just think a bit more about this idea of equilibrium. The usual image of equilibrium, and one that Serres takes as a point of departure, is the set of scales, a very familiar set of scales, right? The classic symbol of justice. Here, in order to establish an equilibrium, there must be an equal weight in each pan. Okay, basic model. That model can be made a little more sophisticated by allowing the arms of each side of that scale to vary in length, so that equilibrium can be established between unequal weights by placing them at the right distance from the central point. Now, as a model, this demonstrates that more than one variable can be included in the equation at a time, of course, but it's still very limited. Most importantly, it's still a model of a static equilibrium. Values are found and placed in such a way as to balance, and once in place, no variation. Serres makes this model, this image, more complex by increasing the number of variables and by allowing them each to vary over time. equilibrium is then no longer static, but rather a stable or quasi-stable unfolding. To speak about this, to make sense of this, Serres turns, again, unsurprisingly, we've heard quite a lot of this already, to Leibniz, and in particular to the calculus of variations. Now, the calculus of variations is sometimes attributed to Johann Bernoulli, but Bernoulli was a student of Leibniz, and it seems that one way or the other, the credit lies with Leibniz. The purpose of the calculus of variations is to find the optimal path in the development of a function with two or more variables. For example, simple example, you have if you imagine a ball rolling down a track from high to low. Okay, the question is, what is the shortest time? What path takes the shortest time to get from the top to the bottom? And we might intuitively think it's a straight line, but it's not. It's a very particular curve that the path must follow. Okay, and Bernoulli called this the brachistochrone, from Greek for the shortest time. Now, just to extend that example slightly, we could imagine a path that takes time, a path that takes the least time between 2 points that lie on a curved plane, like heading down a hilly landscape, for example, and there will be 3 variables defining any particular point on that path. Okay. Ultimately, not only does everything in nature follow a path defined by the calculus of variations, Serres says this, but Leibniz's God, of course, creates the best of all possible worlds by combining all the variables. The world created by Leibniz's God is therefore in equilibrium, all things in harmony. Okay, now it's worth recalling here that equilibrium is not, again, a static condition. And if our aim is to establish an equilibrium in and with the world, a godless Lucretian world, we could say, as Serres' interpretation of the principle of sufficient reason requires, this is not to restore the world to an earlier state or somehow to prevent change, to fix it in some balanced condition. Okay. As Serres tells us in The Birth of Physics, nothing exists in perfect equilibrium. To exist is to be in disequilibrium in some way. But we can aim for states of near equilibrium through quasi-stable change, in which decline may be offset by invention in some way. The principle of sufficient reason calls on us to give sense back to the world then, not just by putting it into words, describing it through, shall we say, the window of our closed study, as Serres might put it, but by participating in the sense-making of the world, in its communication. On Serres' reading of it, the principle of sufficient reason, in fact, promotes an engagement with the world that goes beyond abstract reason. And this brings us back to the notion of narrative that I wanted to focus on today, the linking of one locality to another. Now, in relation to this, the calculus of variations that I mentioned a few moments ago describes an interesting feature regarding scale that I think might be interesting in some practical terms. When you imagine that ball descending down the path between 2 points and following a very specific curve, you could then take a section of that curve and ask the same question. What is the path between these 2 points that takes the shortest time? And interestingly, the answer is a section of the overall curve between the longer path, shall we say, the more extended path. Okay. So, although, and this is important, that curve is changing all the way along, it's not a consistent curve all the way along. It changes as it goes. So each section of that curve is different to every other section, and yet the path that a ball would take to travel between any 2 points on that curve in the shortest time, if you take the solution here, or here, or here, or here, they add together into the whole curve. Each solution to a section is part of, if you like, the solution to the bigger picture. Okay. So to put it in perhaps a little more precisely, the curve of the ball's path as it runs from high to low is not the same all the way along, but the optimal solution for each small stretch, different to all the others, forms part of the optimal solution to the whole path. Okay. Now, Serres states many times that it's impossible to translate directly from the local to the global or vice versa. That's to say, we cannot assume that what works here will work there or anywhere else. But the idea that the optimal path for a given stretch of the curve will be consistent with the optimal solution to the whole curve suggests that working on local solutions is not to, if I can put it this way, to turn one's back on the bigger problem. The solution we find to a problem locally will be consistent with solutions found elsewhere, at least to the extent that the work is done optimally. Okay. Now, Serres writes, when combining variables, the most global sum is always the most correct because it leaves intact the most pluralities. That is, it's most faithful to the complexity of the world. Now, it's perhaps unrealistic to suppose that our sense-making can always be optimal, or maybe ever be optimal. But the more variables that we can include in our appreciation of a situation, shall we say, the better. The more narratives are allowed to intersect and interfere, the better. With this in mind, it's worth reminding ourselves that local here does not designate simply a geographical locality or even necessarily a single discipline, shall we say, but rather a set of related variables. For example, we can think about issues relating to the climate locally, but in most cases they are best addressed when considering multiple sites and their interconnections. The sciences, Serres thinks, are now beginning to think globally in the way he understands this, integrating local modelings and combining variables, both natural and human. But it's not down to the sciences alone, because an optimal response is one that integrates as many variables as possible. Rather, because an optimal response is one that integrates as many variables as possible, it cannot be the work of abstract thinking or the sciences alone. It is, right, Serres, a matter of literature, providing that we understand this in an extended sense that includes all the ways that information is coded in things and all the ways that we can link one locality with another. A line from the Incandescent: "Oh, enchanting surprise, natural history makes science and literature meet. Conversely, the laws of narrative resemble the laws of life." To conclude, let me try and sum up just a few points and that I've put together here, and perhaps some of the one or two of the questions that might emerge out of this. Okay. One, the sense of contracts at play here is not a law imposed on a situation from outside. That's clear. A contract is not static, and neither does it aim to establish a static equilibrium. A contract is dynamic in the sense that it is a regularity. It depends on being made and remade, and this work is best done locally with the view to forming wider links as one goes along. To speak of narrative here is not to disregard the sciences, but to acknowledge a revised relation between causality and law, and then to see that scientific work itself comprises narrative forms, both in the sense that they may use narrative accounts and in the sense that they build narratives by linking one locality to another, however you think that. And then a natural contract needs to include the sciences, especially the climate sciences, of course, but also eco-criticism and other narrative explorations of the communication of the world, the human and the non-human. So finally, what questions or challenges does this all present? Well, many, of course. And I'd like to just suggest at least two or three here. First of all, thinking about how to extend the range of variables we take into account when making sense of a given phenomenon or addressing a given problem. And that question, it seems to me, is not just a technical one in a sense, it's also a political one potentially as well, that sense of how we make sense, what variables we include. Thinking about how to link sense making in one locality with sense making in another. Papers we've already heard this morning from Vera and Lillian have given enormously rich accounts of this already. To me, perhaps the political challenge is to find ways for our engagements with the world, our narratives, to incorporate these. And then finally, to think about how to link work, how best to link work in the sciences to other narrative accounts of communication in the world, of the world, our part in that communication with the world, of the world. If a contract is a work in progress involving an extended engagement with the world understood through multiple narratives, then in order to have a cultural and ultimately political impact, it needs to reach a lot of people. And this in turn means both that there need to be channels of communication that are open and accessible and engaging for a sufficiently large number of people. And achieving this is, well, involves many questions, but in some senses, at least, it's an organizational matter. It concerns education, politics, and perhaps especially so in the view of the fact that in making these connections, in making this thinking accessible, one would be running against the powerful interests of others, shall we say, that might prefer many of those stories not to be told or those connections not to be made. Okay, so, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for a wonderful paper. I'm so very sorry that I have to leave soon because I have to catch the train, but up until now it gets better and better. And so I hope the rest will go online. I'm looking at you also. What I really like is, of course, that you kind of focus on particular terms that are valuable also to rethink the social, but also the political. We've been talking a lot about the political too. It's called Michel Serres and the social, but the political is, of course, crucial. Next question. I mean, we talked about that yesterday also. How do we deal with this? How can we think of politics in terms of contract, in terms of local organizations in that sense? And how would what would that mean for kind of a system which would do more justice to the world around us and not just focus on humans and not just kind of organized through a state apparatus? I mean, it has enormous consequences. You pointed out yourself, but it's a beautiful way to rethink what we have to do at these times. I'm taking a quick thought on how Iceland is now searching for ways to do direct democracy through the internet and kind of searching for ways to kind of move away from the state apparatus.
Thank you, Rick. To be perfectly honest, I wish I had more to say to answer that. There's obviously these are the questions, and they are big and difficult, and I don't know the right ways forwards. And in some ways, I raised these points hoping that there would be a discussion that would take some of the responsibility away from me for trying to answer them here now. I mean, the experiments of that kind might be interesting. I think education is clearly interesting. It's not by chance that in the natural contracts it goes through that whole discussion of the principle of sufficient reason, and then very soon afterwards goes into talking about education. because in some sense this is really about very deeply ingrained tendencies of how we connect and make sense with the world, and that's something which is in some ways difficult to just declare we are now going to do. That takes, in a way, there's a lot of cultivation of our way of experiencing, should we say, that would go into that. I think there are potentially some institutional matters, that can be looked at here. The more we can think about kind of cross disciplinary ways of thinking, the better. The more that we can open up. I think we were talking yesterday, Chris, about ways in which certain questions are framed in certain terms, and of course what that does in effect is not just define a problem, but and define the terms in which you engage with that problem. In effect, in the way I've been talking about it here, it defines a locality, because you define the variables that go into thinking about a particular issue. You could do that in multiple ways, so you can consider people's experience in different ways and try and make sure that when we whoever we is in this situation, I grant it's a complex one, think about these situations and consider what might be done, how to frame this, how to think about this communication that we're having, that there are different ways of doing that which involve different stories, in fact, different narratives, as I've put it here. So that would be one thing, and I think the connected with that, and to link to the way I was talking about narratives just towards the end here, it's possible that can be done in ways that actually provide connections between ways of localities that we might not otherwise think of as being connected in a way. It might extend our thinking in certain ways about problems. I mean, I feel I'm talking a very quite basic terms here about questions which both Lynn and Vera have really elaborated in very sophisticated ways. But I'm just trying to think about how it might work. Some of these questions might work or play through the idea of narrative, which seems important here for contract, as Serres talks about it.
Okay, so we're going to go Bill, then Joanna, and then Lily.
People this side.
Oh, sorry.
Did
Did you have your hand? You have. We'll go to Peter then.
First or me first? Me first. Thanks, Dave. That, as always, was lucid and properly helpful. So, what I'm going to offer in return is a little bit tentative, but hear me out.
No, good.
There is you're absolutely right. There's there's two forms of equilibrium he's talking about. One belongs to Aristotle and one belongs to Leibniz.
Yeah.
Aristotle, fairly straightforward, just a linear, proportional allocation of goods for services or what have you, for money, that kind of thing. That's law.
Yeah.
But we also want to talk about a natural indeed, ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
And from this, he got for this, he got to Leibniz. And he doesn't quite give away. I think you're right to dig into the variational calculus there, because he doesn't quite give away how much more complicated that is, and where exactly he's taking it from Leibniz. Well, obviously, it's the places where Leibniz forms the variational calculus. So you look to the mathematical works. But with the same suspicion, probably, as Serres always has, that wherever there's a mathematical principle, there will be a material principle popping up somewhere in theology or the natural.
Yeah.
I went looking for it, and I think I found it. What he's thinking of when he thinks of the variational calculus.
Okay.
And why is it variational calculus rather than differential calculus? Because we can use differential calculus to occur. I think he specifies that because the sort of elements of variational calculus are in themselves formulae. So what you input is already a calculation. So you have a kind of a meta. The operator there is a meta operator on the set of things you're interested in.
Yeah.
And it's right, that's that's how you get to the least path. The principle of least action really is what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Fine, okay, so where do you find that when Leibniz is not talking about matter, he's talking about God? Well, it's in the Theodicy, where he says that we don't worry about whether or not God exhausts all the possibilities. We might be worried about this. I know there might be a possible world that he's missed out. No. The maximal answer is the best answer is in that great quote he gave. That's Leibniz's words.
Yeah.
And how do you get there? Well, you get there by inputting all of the possible paths into one meta operator, the variational calculus. And he says this, well, what does God do when he looks out at the world? He says in the Theodicy, he looks over the set of things, but he also looks, and that's an infinite thing in itself, but it's doubly infinite because he also looks over all the relations of all things.
Yes.
And the interrelation between those things.
Yes.
This is what sufficient reason actually is.
Yeah.
So there's a double infinity there written into that picture that comes from Leibniz that I think gives perhaps a possible slight twist on what we might think of then as literature, because if the literature is among those sets of things, it is also rich in its own interrelations within the pages of the clue. And in the interrelation between one book and another, it's that part of that multiplicitous subsumption of sufficient reason that I just suspect, he never says, of course, but I think that's what he's thinking of when he goes to Leibniz rather than Aristotle for that equilibrium.
That makes absolute sense, Bill. I think I'm confident that you're right about that. And it seems to me that what Serres gives us to think in this connection thing is that obviously this isn't just about literature. This is about the writing of the world. This is about the narratives which are constitutive of and run through all things. And which themselves are contracts. In fact, that was the point. Is that to think of a contract here is to think of a narrative, because it's not a single one-off document that is signed and takes effect in a particular way, but it's an ongoing regularity which may itself vary, modify as it goes along, and there are multiple, of course, and this then becomes, it seems to me, the point I wanted to make is at that point then, when you think of it in these terms, we are dealing with questions which are at once scientific and political in a broad sense, because it's about how in our engagement with the world, what narratives we pick up and how we understand their connection. And that's both a scientific question and a political question, it seems. So, yeah.
We've got Joanna, Lillian, Bernadette, Peter, and 5 minutes.
I'll try and be quick.
I've run it over a little bit, but if we could try somewhat to compress the questions and answers, we'll try and get them all in.
I'll compress it. So the notion of linking local to local and the notion of the ground narrative really redeploy the notion of narrative in ways that put a lot of stress on the term.
Yeah.
I worry in any case about the translation of Récits narrative because of anxieties coming out of the Ricoeur-Derrida encounter, where Ricoeur seemed to think that temporality was continuous because narrative was continuous, and one could always retrogressively reconstitute linkages which reaffirm some kind of necessary continuous history. So we need to think these narratives in terms of discontinuity rather than narrative isn't the right word
Mhm.
at all.
Mhm.
The same kind of anxiety I have about the word engagement.
Mhm.
You know, they claim that what we all need to do is somehow engage in a different kind of way in the play
Okay.
of the things of the world. It
Yeah.
seems to me that the notion of detachment is maybe
Mhm.
more sonorous
Yeah.
with respect to letting whatever it is that's harmonizing out there resonate such that we can hear it. So
Mm.
both those words in English seem to me to be freighted with all kinds of problems, and I guess especially in a translating from French to English kind of way. I mean, it takes you back to recur and start, and the danger is that you end up with a Saffian engagement. You know, let's do Saffian engagement all over again, or let's do recur's notion to Récits. And that would be to take Serres into a certain French traditionalism, which isn't going to help us underline just what a departure it is. So that's my worry about those two terms and what kind of way it might be possible to talk local to local narrative without saying narrative.
Mhm. Mhm. I guess I need to say something very quickly to respond very quickly to this, so I'll just offer you a first thought. I think with regard to start with the second one, with regard to engagement, yeah, you're probably right. It's not, maybe that's a really bad choice of term. Detachment might be valuable there, although perhaps I was also thinking of the way in which Sarah talks of trying to alter or reverse to some extent the negligence that we have towards the world. He does use that word, negligence, that we just don't. And actually, we do need to attend to it. We do need to pay attention to it. And that there's a diligence which he asks for. So it was in that area that I was looking, but maybe engagement itself wasn't a good choice of word. With regard to narrative, yeah, I'm not sure. I absolutely hear those concerns about where it places him in relation to other thinkers, and that's potentially problematic. Just thinking in terms of Serres' own work, I don't necessarily find the idea of a narrative so problematic in the sense that this is about how one event follows from another. There is no, there is the sense of continuity there might be given by that series of events being determined in some way, such that one will inevitably unfold in a certain way. Once things are started, it's going to go like this. But that's not how he describes the unfolding of one event after another through, because the causal series is, at least initially, not is indeterminate and it's not law governed. And even when it has formed a regularity, of course, that can change. There is the Klingon, there are complications from open systems and so forth. But there'll always be variation in that. And we have bifurcations. That's as obviously we know his term for how this works. So does narrative convey too much of a sense of continuity? I don't know. Maybe this is I can see why you might think that. I have to say I don't always find that myself because of the sense of divergence, deviation, bifurcation that comes with that, as I understand it. But
we could talk more later.
Yeah.
There's so many others.
Okay. I think I had actually quite the same question. My question was also about narrative, and yeah, it just made me think a lot about because what you just said now clarified it. I think for me also what a narrative can mean for law, also like a specific understanding of narrative, because with the examples you gave, I also sometimes had the impression it's about metaphors like in the sense that Serres also uses it as like a relation that works in both directions, that in which the reference works in both directions, which is a really strong understanding. And how the narrative is different from a figure, or whether there's like a kind of figure aspect in the examples he gave. So I was also just thinking about what makes it a narrative. I think there is something to be learned from narrative. I'm just curious.
Mhm. Yeah. The idea of figure certainly would be a way of thinking about this. I guess the reason I think there are two reasons why I've stuck here with the idea of narrative. Okay. One is that, and obviously this comes back to your question to Anna, is about the grand récit, about this idea of grand narrative, if that's the way it's translated. Okay, so which is the totality of all possible stories which are going on and interfering with each other in different ways, in different levels, and so forth, different scales, right? So that, in that sense, the term is already there, and I suppose what I was trying to do is think, okay, well, how do we end up with something that fits into that context? If we begin with something that we can read in the Birth of Physics as a contract, which is already apparently narrative in form. So that helped. Yeah, there seemed to be an interesting set of steps and possible connections that were going on there, and I was trying to see if I could follow some of those along. Now, what was your other point was, which has now gone straight out of my mind, Lillian, sorry, was there was another point you made.
Narrative in relation to law is where you start.
Yeah, I maybe another point was there another point? I mean, something I had in mind was metaphors as well, and how you would.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I was sorry. The other point I was going to, that's what I just remembered. It's one of those things where I think, right, there are two things I want to say about this, and I say one, and then of course forget the other. The second point was that this idea of sense making, about why narrative. Well, this idea of sense making as the connection of one locality to another, in the way in which we translate, and that sense making is translation for Serres, which is something that has to be performed and not just observed in some fashion. So, and that then, it seems to me, links, and then you go link. Of course, this is not necessarily following any narrowly linear path, that we link localities in different ways, and in doing so begin to link ways of thinking and events through translations. And it seems to me that narrative fitted there as well. But I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's various concerns here raised about the idea of narrative, about that term. So it might be something that needs to be rethought in terms of in this context and how it's used.
Okay, just quickly, well, there's 2 points, but I think Chris's talk may be covering the second one. It was about how working towards near equilibrium is connected to the parasitic symbiotic relationship, which is obviously a sort of universal process. But shall I leave that, and we'll probably pick that up unless you want to say something quickly?
I'm sure it will come up. I mean, just very briefly to indicate the direction I was thinking about that is that that we don't arrive at a static form of equilibrium because for anything to exist, it is always in a state of disequilibrium, whether we're thinking about individual things or systems or collections of things or whatever, right? So we're always dealing with a disequilibrium of some kind, and for Serres, it seems to me the question is how to hold that in a, well, there is a question about how to hold that in a state where it doesn't just spiral completely out of control. So you have then he talks, for example, about about occupying the minimal angle and just holding things in states of close to stability, but not completely stable. And that's something which, of course, requires continual work because it requires invention to reestablish orders of certain kinds, not always the same, which kind of hold things back from slipping too fast down the slope to dissolution.
The second quick point, it's more an observation, really. I mean, I'm struck by when you read texts by, I'm thinking, Dipesh Chakrabarty, the post-colonial writer who writes a lot about climate change, Amitav Ghosh, Great Arrangement. They're very wide thinking. They're looking at a grand narrative, you might say. And then you've got a lot of thinkers about climate change, such as Stenger's, intrusion of Gaia, but also arrangement. And what comes across quite often is we need a new story. Yeah. Now, often we need a new story that includes capitalism, includes colonialism, but goes beyond it. We know capitalism is behind a lot of climate change in some respects. No colonialism, we can go back and say it goes right to the beginning. But they cry out for a new story. And I think, although I take the point about there may be some problematics about narrative, I think there is widening an opportunity for a big narrative that includes the natural contract and the grand narrative.
Just very quickly, that's a very thank you for that suggestion, that observation. I would just say that perhaps by inclination, I think I can see there's value in that idea of a new story, which includes different things, and in some sense, I guess I was suggesting that when I talked about ways of including different variables in the appreciation of a situation, but I'd also want to add, by way of kind of counterbalance or alternative, that there are risks in saying, okay, here is the story. It's going to include this and this. Because it seems to me that what Serres suggesting, the idea that comes out of his work, it seems to me, and one which seems plausible and right to me, is that you have to begin with the really tiny little stories. It's all about the detail and specificity, and that if we decide in advance too quickly about what the story is and about what, then you immediately begin to close down what particular stories can be included in this and how they're to be told, what form they should take and so forth. And
interestingly, that's book he actually refers quite famously to Marx and Hegel, which I think that they are part of the narrative that is recognised.
Bernadette, you've been very patient indeed with your hand up for so long. Please do ask your question.
Thank you. My question is also about the narrative, but maybe I would approach it through asking you if you could please specify the relations between the local and the global. I mean, it's clear for you that the local is not just deducible from the global, and reciprocally that the global is not the sum of the localities. So the idea of localities as sites of interconnection involving a number of variables seems to me to really question the idea of scalability between local and global. And in that case, for the narrative, would it mean that there is only the possibility, the grand narrative, the grand récit, would be the connection between the little narratives, the little local narratives, rather than an all-embracing big picture? And I don't know.
Thank you. That's a really, really good question. The way that I've framed that, in the paper, I think that you're absolutely right to pick up on it, and I've not done enough to avoid that difficulty. I think, I think one would have to. You're absolutely right. It'd be really important to think about issues of scalability there. the I think those questions can be addressed. I think they can be addressed probably, I think, by thinking about how connections happen, how order emerges, what forms of regularity recur in certain ways, the patterns of invariance that Serres talks about, and then I think you could find that there is. I don't think the two approaches would be inconsistent. Let me put it that way. But I take your point that here probably what I've described places a lot of emphasis on developing connections from one locality to another rather than across scales, and that would be a really interesting way to extend this way of thinking if that's what one could do. Yeah,
I think we're going to have to stop there. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.